but ultimately, how do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? This is where we need to be able to give our kids some of this really good evidence for the resurrection. What is the historical evidence for the resurrection? How do we know that God exists? How can we be confident in these things?
Now, this show, of course, is all about hope. That's why we're calling it Hope One. What do you think kids most need to know in order to understand that their hope is in Jesus through all this crisis we're going through right now? What do they need to know? What's the bottom line about that, Natasha?
Well, a couple of things. I think first and foremost, and as parents, I think we skip over this way too much, but our kids need to understand that our hope is in Jesus if and only if Christianity is true. So we want them to understand this isn't a wishful kind of thinking. This isn't a, oh, I really hope, that things are going to go well for me after I die because my hope is in Jesus. We want them to understand this is a matter of truth and pursuing truth. I told my twins when they were 6 years old, I remember this conversation. I said, I do not want you to grow up and say that the reason that you believe in Jesus is because I did as your mom. I want you to know that God has given us lots of evidence and there are ways to pursue the truth, and that I'm going to teach you that over time. And I think that that's a really huge starting point for a kid. Just understand that hope is well justified hope when we're talking about it in this way. The second thing is, I think our kids need to understand what the truth test is for Christianity. Ultimately, okay, fine. And my hope is in Jesus if it's true. How do I know that it's true? And so this is where we point them back to 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. I tell my kids this all the time. It just doesn't matter. Nothing about Christianity matters if Jesus wasn't actually raised from the dead. And so it doesn't, all these other questions that come up about, well, I don't know about this in the Bible or that in the Bible. Ultimately, it comes back to a question about the resurrection. And so I like to keep my kids very focused on that. And then, of course, that should lead us to say, okay, well, it is based on the resurrection. That's the truth test. But ultimately, how do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? This is where we need to be able to give our kids some of this really good evidence for the resurrection. What is the historical evidence for the resurrection? How do we know that God exists? How can we be confident in these things? So in my mind, those are kind of the 3 steps. But at the end of the day, when our kids know that, yes, my hope is in Jesus, they also have to understand why that matters so much. And I've always said, and I know this sounds really a little bit depressing, but I've always said that I don't think kids can understand hope if they don't understand the hopelessness of this world if Christianity wasn't true. So I like to compare and contrast that and say, hey, if atheism is true, if there is no God, then this life is objectively meaningless and you're going to die, you're going into the ground, all this stuff with the coronavirus, you could die and that's going to be the end, and it was for nothing. That's why hope matters, because at a time like this, people start to really realize, okay, there has to be something more. There has to be something redeemable out of this. Of course, we don't want to just have the wishful thinking, but we do want our kids to understand that there's a big difference between hope that, is a little significant and hope that means everything in the world. And that's the hope of Christianity.